many of you here are wounded individuals? How many of you are hurting? You might think these questions are a strange thing to ask. But if you are not in touch with your wounds and your hurts, you are not fully in touch with yourself or with God. And if you are not in touch with your wounds and your hurts, you cannot be a true soul friend to another. A soul friend is not a person you have in your life because they make you laugh. A soul friend is one whom you can walk with through the valleys of life. A soul friend is someone who helps you carry your cross when, like Jesus, you fall and are too weak to carry it alone. I most appreciate being a part of a liturgical tradition during Holy Week, which begins today. The services this week are dramatic and powerful, and they have enriched the lives of Christians for centuries. They are full of symbols which for thousands of years have shaped our faith. And of course, the symbol that stands out for today's liturgy is a man hanging, beaten, and dying on a cross. Today, the liturgy doesn't ask us to think about an empty cross. That will come. Today, the liturgy asks us to think about a crucifix, a cross with a human being on it that is slowly dying. We call Jesus our healer, but Palm Sunday is a powerful reminder that he is a wounded healer. Even the very name that we give to this day, many know it as Palm Sunday, but that is only a small part of the liturgy of this day. The dominant theme of today is Jesus' journey to the cross, which is why for most of Christian history today is known as the Sunday of the Passion. And by the word passion, I must remind you, we are not talking about simply emotions. Passion, the word passion comes from the Latin, and it means suffering. Thus, today, the symbols, the readings, and the emphasis of the liturgy is on the day of suffering. The gospel reading has deeper meaning when we know something about the context in which that suffering occurred, which we remember this day. Soldiers prepared to condemn men for the cross by scourging, by beating them 39 lashes from a whip called a cat o' nine tails. And this was a rod about a foot long with 9 leather straps. And attached to the end of each strap was a piece of broken rock with sharp edges. The aim of the scourging was to remove every bit of flesh from the back without killing the person. In our story this morning, we hear that after scourging him, the soldiers taunted Jesus, making fun of him as the King of the Jews. That they formed a crown of thorns, and the thorns were 1 to 2 inches long, and the soldiers pressed the thorns on his head so hard, the scriptures say, the thorns pierced his skull. The soldiers then placed on him a robe of purple. After the mockery was over, Jesus was forced to carry his own cross to the hill upon which he would die. The people came to see there what was going on. And they stood on both sides of the road, cursing and jeering him. The cross was so heavy, he fell beneath the load, and eventually another had to be pressed into service to carry it. Crucifixion itself is probably unmatched throughout history for the severity of torment it brought. To die on a cross was the most painful and cruel form of death that the ancient world had devised. The condemned man was affixed to the cross with nails driven through his wrists and feet. Through experimentation and study of anatomy, the Romans had discovered the medial nerve, located just above the wrist, and the joint and the center of the foot. The weight of the body caused the nail to press against this nerve, shooting horrific pain throughout the nerves of the body. Not only was there pain, there was the struggle to breathe. The weight of the body pulling down on the outstretched arms and shoulders would tend to fix the intercostal muscles in the position of inhalation. And the only way a man could exhale would be to lift his arms and push with his legs to hold himself up for a few seconds to allow air to escape from his lungs. To avoid suffocation, the man was forced to cause his own excruciating pain by putting more pressure on the medial nerve. The average lifespan of a person on the cross was 3 to 4 days. After 4 days, the soldiers would help the person to die quickly by breaking his legs so that he could not use them to push himself upward to exhale. After a few hours, the muscles in the shoulders would lock, and the man would die from exhaustion, asphyxia, or suffocation. Jesus apparently was not a physically strong man. Not only could he not carry his own cross after his beating, but he died only after 6 hours on the cross. So when you hear that description of how Jesus died, what happens to you? Do you just want to hear something else? Something that is a little closer to the picture of Jesus that each of us have in our minds? Several years ago, some of you may remember that Mel Gibson was responsible for a movie called The Passion of Christ. It was a particularly noted rendition of the Passion because of its gore and violence. And I remember going to see it, and I went kind of in midday, and there were a group of older women in front of me. And what amazed me about that scene was that they were eating popcorn while all of this suffering and gore was going on the screen. And then I heard one of them whisper to the person next to her, and she said, "Why does it have to be so gory?" It has to be so gory because it was so gory. And we tend to forget, or we tend not to want to see. The scriptures describe Jesus as wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Isaiah says, "Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his wounds we are healed. The Jesus that the church wants us to remember today is indeed a wounded healer. Palm Sunday reminds us in vivid detail what Isaiah was talking about. But the gospel is not just out there. It's personal. And that's why it is by our wounds that we become a healing community. You and I need to be in touch with our own wounds because it is through our own brokenness that we are able to be authentic with other people. You know, God has a vision for us as a community. It is a vision that involves more than saying hello to each other on Sunday mornings. God's vision for us involves more than us being able to go to each other's home and share a meal together, though that is a great start. God's vision for us is that we are healed. And reality tells us that our emotional and psychological healing is not magical. It doesn't just happen. Whatever healing we receive happens over time and often comes through relationships. In other words, we need each other. And we need our relationships. We need our relationships to be real and authentic. If you and I want to be made whole, we must first be in touch with our wounds. And if we are to be healers and soul friends to each other, we can only do that out of an awareness of our wounds. Here's how the Apostle Paul writes about that vision to the Corinthians. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all consolation, who consoles us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to console those who are in any affliction with the consolation with which we ourselves are consoled by God. When I think about this topic, I am reminded of an analogy that I have used before, but it's such a great analogy, I can't help but use it. Plus, I had the last apple at home. So, and this comes from Larry Crabb, who's an author and Christian psychologist, and he says, consider this apple. It's shiny. It's appetizing. And sometimes we, like this apple, will encourage another to take a bite of it, to get to know us a bit. But rarely do we ask for someone to take a second bite, because that will take them deeper. And we are afraid. We are afraid that if in fact they go deeper with us, they will discover our greatest fear. And that is that there is a worm in our apple. What we are really saying is, if you really know me, you might throw up. If you really knew me, you would be repulsed. If you really knew me, you wouldn't love me. All of us live with some version of this fear. It is no wonder we can't be truly intimate. The fact of the matter is that most of us are afraid of intimacy, while at the same time, intimacy and connection is the thing that we most desire. We all want to be known, even as we are afraid of being known. I mean, don't you want to be loved and accepted for who you are and not the mask that you put on or the perception that others have of you? Why do we want this so much for ourselves, but are afraid when we come so close to it in another? You see, the truth is that you really don't know me until you know something of the struggles and the battles that I fight in my interior life. When you know my battles, you know me. It's unfortunate that we in the Christian community are willing to settle for far too little in our relationships with each other. We have become content with little more than a name, an address, and a phone number. Most Christians in a community don't get beyond that. Sometimes we might be able to share in the trials and struggles of another person's illness. Sometimes we might be able to share in another's grief that comes with the loss of a loved one. But still there is more known about us and shared. And that is what Jesus prays for. And what the Apostle Paul is saying is that you cannot be a friend to others who are hurting if you are not in touch with your own hurts and wounds. Most of us remain content with a hello and a dinner, and we secretly harbor resentment that there is not much more to the spiritual life. But there is more. There is a lot more. But we don't get there unless we journey through the most broken parts of who we are. The jarring nature of today, the Sunday of the Passion, is that we often want our religion to always be about happy things. But today is a glaring reminder that grace is not cheap. And perhaps that's why we call grace amazing grace. Today, Jesus is before us not in triumph, but in weakness. It is in his weakness that we are healed, and it is through our weaknesses that we will become soul friends to one another, and that we will become the people and the community that God intends. Amen.